Welcome to World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. Our mission at World Methodist Evangelism is to provide resources and events to strengthen discipleship and equip Christ followers to share their faith in Jesus Christ. My name is Rob Haynes of World Methodist Evangelism, and I will be your host today. Today we're going to ask a question: where is Jesus in the midst of suffering? And we're very blessed to be with Dr. Ben Witherington, who is the Gene R. Amos Professor of New Testament of Doctoral Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. This podcast is made possible through the generosity of Christ Church Global in Memphis, Tennessee, and we thank them for their support. Ben, thank you for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
Help our listeners get to know you a little bit more. Tell us some more about you first.
Well, I'm a cradle Methodist. My mom says my first two words were John Wesley. I'm kind of doubting that. But, and someday I'll be a grave Methodist, I suppose. But in between that, I've been in the Methodist Church all my life. I was ordained in PC before cell phone in the 70s and have served 6 churches in Western North Carolina. But for the last 35 plus years, I have been teaching at various places. I taught a little bit at High Point College. I taught at Duke Divinity School. I taught at Vanderbilt Divinity School. But in terms of full-time teaching, I taught for 11 years at Ashland Seminary, which is a Brethren seminary in Northeast Ohio. And then since 95, I've been at Asbury Theological Seminary teaching there. So that's kind of the career trajectory. I'm also odd in that I never applied for any teaching jobs. They came and got me. So I was happy enough pastoring and doing a little bit of teaching, but really the majority of my professional life has been in the academy.
Well, and you've written over 6 books. You've written commentaries on every book of the New Testament. You've been a contributor in so many different places. So thank you for joining us on Skype today in the midst of your busy schedule. So let's just start really broadly. You know, you and I are recording this here the last week of March of 2020. We're asking a lot of questions about what's going on in the world and why. So let's just start with something really broad. Where is Jesus in the midst of suffering like this?
These kinds of questions, of course, have been asked for centuries and even millennia since Christ came. And there's a lot of different ways to approach this. But one of the things that is a sort of bedrock for me is asking the question, what did Jesus do when he came the first time? And the answer is he went after disease, decay, and death. He cured people of diseases. He counteracted death by raising several people from the dead, and so on. Now, if Jesus is the clearest revelation of the character of God, which I take it he is, then it seems very clear that disease, decay, and death is not the will of God. If it was, Jesus came and opposed the will of God. So I'm taking that as a sort of starting point as to how to think about these kind of issues. If you have a meaningful theology of the fallenness of the world, then disease, decay, and death, or evil in general, can be attributed to the fact that we live in a fallen world. And that's exactly what I would say. Even in the Old Testament, we have inklings or clues of how not to read the disasters, even though our insurance companies all call them acts of God. For example, 1 Kings 19 is really very clear. Elijah goes to Mount Horeb, aka Mount Sinai, and on this occasion, God doesn't say, take 2 tablets, call me in the morning, like he did to Moses. On this occasion, we are told that Elijah learns the following. We're told there was a great conflagration, a fire. God was not in the conflagration. There was an earthquake. God was not in the earthquake, and so on. In other words, you can't read God's will from natural disasters like COVID-19. You just can't do that. And anybody who is a doomsday prophet who has tried to do that had about 100% chance of being wrong about it. So these things happen in the world that we live in. It's a fallen world. Bad things even happen to God's people. Now, that's not to say that it is not true that God can work all things together for good. He can. But God is not the only actor in the universe. There are, in fact, a lot of them, angelic, human, and the Trinity. They're all involved in what's going on here. And in addition to all that, there are natural processes that God set in motion as well. So it cannot be sort of simplistically reduced to why is God doing this to us? Because the answer very well may be, no, we did this to ourselves. Through our ignorance, through our carelessness, we spread this disease all over.
So that's a really good question that you bring up next, I think. As a Wesleyan and biblical scholar, help us understand a little bit of the biblical understanding of God's sovereignty and God's goodness. Are these sufferings that we face, whether they be personal or global or otherwise, a direct result of God's action, or what's our agency in that as humanity?
Well, I think you have to have a theology of secondary causes. And it's interesting to me that if you compare the parallel accounts in 1st and 2nd Samuel with what's going on in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, for example, what's attributed broadly to God in 1st and 2nd Samuel is attributed to Satan in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, in a broad sense, of course, nothing could happen without the will of God. But the question is it his active will? Is it his passive will? What's going on with that? Well, if God has enabled other beings in creation to have a will and have the power of contrary choice to do things against God's will, that's what sin is. If that's true, then God is not the only actor in the situation. Of course, God is sovereign. That's not the question. The question is, how does he exercise his sovereignty? So let me tell you a typical Methodist joke about this. So a Presbyterian and a Methodist are going to a ministerial meeting in downtown Mobile.
Right.
And it's pouring cats and dogs. And they get there together and they're going down these slippery steps to get into the sanctuary for the meeting. And the Calvinist is a little bit ahead and he slips down the stairs and he picks himself up at the bottom and says, well, I'm glad that's over with. And the Methodist is right behind him and he's just as careless and he slides down the stair and gets to the bottom and says, I'm going to have to be more careful next time. Now, there are two whole different theologies of God's sovereignty in those two little statements.
Right.
One assumes I was destined to do that from before the foundation of the universe, and I'm glad it's over with. The other assumes, no, God didn't do this to me. My carelessness did this to me. I need to be more careful next time. Now, that's the difference between a more Calvinistic way of looking at the sovereignty of God and a more Arminian way of looking at the sovereignty of God.
So oftentimes when things are a little bit out of control personally, I've heard people take comfort in the idea of saying that God is in control. So then that what you just told us, it puts us in a little bit of a different posture in that God is in control, but there is something that I have that I can do as I respond to that. So I guess that would lead the next question. What is the role of the church in responding to these sufferings globally and even personally?
Well, there are a lot of responses, of course. One of which, of course, is praying for those who are suffering and being careful to do what we're being asked to do by the governor of Kentucky and various others. In other words, practice social distancing, be careful in washing our hands, whenever we have interactions with other persons, just to be cautious. I mean, that's just common sense. That's just practical advice. But there's more to think about in regard to this as well. The people who are on the front line of all this, our nurses and our doctors and our EMT people, are, from all reports, just completely stressed out. So what can we do to support and help them? Well, one of the things that's happening local is we've got a lot of church people who are preparing meals for the families of the nurses and the doctors and the EMT people and delivering them to hospitals and delivering them to homes, and at least taking that part of their burden out of the picture. And that's just, again, just a little practical thing that can be done. And so, I think that's one of the ways we can respond. But one of the things that these kind of disasters should prompt us to do is do some serious thinking about the meaning of suffering.
Yes.
Among other things, it tells us that we are vulnerable, that we are fragile, that we are all too mortal. And anybody who thinks they're immune to diseases like this is not being honest with themselves. It's not being honest with themselves, never mind anybody else. But here's part of the problem, Rob. We live in the most narcissistic age, in the most narcissistic culture in the world. It's all about me. I mean, my goodness, think about the term selfie for a minute. It's all about myself, me taking pictures of myself and then spreading it all over the world on Facebook. Now think about that for a minute. With that kind of orientation in life, of course, people are not going to think of others first. People are not going to naturally live self-sacrificially. One of the things that it means to be a fallen person is the heart is turned in upon itself. We are inherently, as fallen persons, self-centered persons. And when things like this happen, all we're caring about mostly is taking care of ourselves, watching out for ourselves, getting out of the way of harm, and that sort of stuff. I mean, that's a natural fight or flight kind of reaction of a narcissistic person. And so our Christianity very quickly goes out the window or out the door because of our inherent narcissism. Because what happens is, in a situation like this, fear-based thinking takes over and faith-based thinking just disappears. That's well, that's all very altruistic and aspirational and et cetera, et cetera. That's all very nice of you, but I need to look after myself first. And that's the most important thing. Well, let's think about that for a minute. Jesus came to earth, and one of the things he says about his mission was, I did not come to be served or to be self-serving. I came to serve and to give my life as a ransom for the many. Mark 10:45. Well, let's think about that for a minute. One of the things he came to do, besides counteract disease, decay, and death, is to die for other people. Real self-sacrifice. Not just something, real self-sacrifice. Well, then, Jesus doesn't think that suffering and even dying is the be-all and end-all of existence. Indeed, he sees it as a means to atone for the sins of the world and bring redemption. Now, that should just change our whole theology of suffering. We don't avoid suffering at all costs. In fact, the most courageous people in the world are those who are prepared to suffer for others, like our doctors, like our nurses, and so on. I mean, they They are imaging Christ in so much better way than most of us who are just huddled in our houses and biting our fingernails. So part of the problem, the biggest problem, is the message of our culture, our secular culture, is this life is all there is. You got to grab for all the gusto you can get because there's only this one life and then you die. So if that's true, which, by the way, ancient pagans believed those sorts of things, Cicero believed that sort of thing. That's not a Christian or Judeo-Christian response to all of this. If that's so, then the number one thing we got to do is prevent ourselves from dying, which is why we spend billions and trillions on healthcare in America. And the mantra over at the hospital is this life is all there is. At all costs, preserve it. Well, Christians don't believe that. They believe in a little thing called everlasting life. They believe this life is only the, as John Wesley said, the antechamber to eternity. And therefore, what we do with ourselves in this life is not at all costs avoid suffering, at all costs avoid dying, at all costs prop up somebody's life, even if they have to live on a ventilator for the rest of their 1 or 2 years of life. No, that's not the way a Christian should look at life. It's certainly not the way that Jesus looked at his life. And we're supposed to be imitating him. So I think that if we ask, what is Jesus doing right now? He's suffering with us. I want you to think about that for a minute. Think about Paul on Damascus Road. What is that weird thing that Jesus said to Paul when he flattened him on Damascus Road? Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He doesn't say, why are you persecuting my people? He says, why are you persecuting me? It's because the head of the body suffers with the body, and he's the head of the body of Christ. We are the members of the body of Christ. So the number one answer to the question, where is Jesus in all this, is he's suffering with the suffering.
You bring up so many good points there. I think this me culture that we live in the United States and in many parts of the world has been evident in the panic buying. It's how can I be as comfortable as possible through all of this? And there are some necessities that one needs, but you know, the woman in front of me in the store a few weeks ago that was buying 100 rolls of toilet paper at that time, I can only hope she was buying for everyone in the neighborhood and not necessarily stocking up for whatever happens there. But we've seen this panic buying be at a detriment to those who need basic necessities while other people are hoarding.
And that's just ultimate narcissism. You know, it's all about me and my comfort and et cetera. I was in the grocery store yesterday, in Kroger's yesterday, and in the cake section, somebody had made a cake in the shape of a roll of toilet paper and written in blue ice on top of it, the last roll. That cracked me up.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if we could learn from the Good Samaritan's account in this that Jesus gives, when the one who is the neighbor is the one who shows mercy. And sometimes mercy is not taking everything that you see. Sometimes mercy is staying home like you've been told to. Sometimes mercy is distancing yourself as you should and really being denied a few creature comforts of yourself so that someone else may live and flourish in that too.
Absolutely. Absolutely, that's right. You know, I mean, if it may sound trite today, we've gotten rid of our WWJD bracelets some time ago. What would Jesus do?
Right.
But it's right to ask that question. What would he do in this situation? One of my favorite Christian writers from World War I is Geoffrey Studdard Kennedy. And he was in the trenches in the Maginot Line during World War I as the chaplain of men that were just being brutally blown to pieces or gassed or this, that, and the other. And it prompted in him a lot of reflection on suffering and sorrow and why does God do all of this, and or why does he allow it? And there's a powerful poem by him called The Sorrow of God. And at the beginning of the poem, he reflects on the sorrow of God must be hard to bear if he's really got love in his heart. And the poem begins with the assumption God is either a monster or he just doesn't care because he's doing all of this stuff. He's allowing this to happen. But by the end of the poem, he realizes, no, there are a lot of actors in the universe. There are a lot of causes of a variety of different things. God is not the only actor in the universe. And where you can see him most clearly and see his nature revealed most clearly is on the cross. He's suffering for us and with us in the life that we live. And that's a powerful message. Now, some people will say, well, he protected me, or he healed my grandmother. She had the virus and she got well, which is fine and true. But think about that for a minute. That's only a temporary good. It's only a temporary expedient. Because what really matters is you have everlasting life.
Right.
However many times your physical existence is propped up again, even if it's done so miraculously, okay, it's the temporary good. It's not an eternal good. It's a temporary benefit. And at the end of the day, God's not interested in endlessly propping up this mortal frame that's eventually going to disappear. If you read Gulliver's Travels, written by Jonathan Swift, who, by the way, was a pretty amazing preacher. He was the dean of the cathedral in Dublin, Ireland. And one of the things that in Gulliver's Travels he has a man who is granted one wish by God. And he said, I want to live forever in my physical existence. What he forgot to ask for is that I don't want to keep getting older. I don't want to keep decaying. And so this poor soul gets older and older and more decrepit and less mobile and less comfortable and etc. Yes, he has everlasting life in this body, but what good is that? I mean, he's like Jabba the Hutt. He can't go anywhere or do anything, right? Well, that's not God's view. The big view of God is, yes, he does heal it. Yes, he protects us from time to time. But his big goal is to have us in fellowship with him for everlasting life. That's the big goal. So these sufferings and sorrows and even these deaths should cause us to reflect on what really is the bigger picture, God's perspective on all of this. And God's perspective is this too will pass. The question is, will you pass the final exam when Jesus comes back?
What a great point. This too shall pass. And I think it brings up a really interesting question about the time of the year in which this happened. So a week or two ago, the President of the United States said he had hoped that everyone would return to normal by Easter, which in itself is an interesting symbolism that even the popular culture picked up on. Now we know that probably will not be the case, and we'll be, self-isolated for much longer. But as I'm watching churches around the country and around the world wrestle with what to do about Easter, I think the message of resurrection at this particular time really speaks into this. So what does the resurrection have to say to our current culture in terms of this? So what can pastors do to help share that message in such a climate?
Like the African American friends of mine who have preached this sermon many times say, it may be Good Friday, but Sunday's coming.
Right.
Or to put it another way, God's yes to life is louder and trumps this world's no to life. So God's going to have the last say on this. That's what resurrection is all about. God gets the last say on all of this. We don't get the last say. Death doesn't get the last say. We are told in 1 Corinthians 15 that death is a formidable enemy, but it's the last one to be overcome by means of the resurrection. So the resurrection is the nullification of death's finality. And that is a message that should preach every Easter.
Exactly. Well, wow, what a great several great points that you've given us to think about. Ben, let me ask you this. How has your study of these types of things shaped your own Christian discipleship? How has this formed you?
Well, in a time like this, reasonable precautions should be taken and to, protect your family, and especially if, for example, if you're the lone breadwinner for your wife and your children and your grandchildren, or almost so, well, reasonable precautions need to be taken. I might be able to be careless for myself if I was an isolated individual, but as a Christian, I can't be careless for others if others are depending on me. That's just wrong. So that's one of the things. And that's actually part of being selfless. Being careful is a way of being selfless for the benefit of the others who shouldn't have to worry about you being ridiculous and going out fate and going to coronavirus parties and that sort of nonsense, like what happened in California the other day. So that's part of it. But one of the things I've done a lot of reflecting on recently on my blog, on my Pathos blog, The Bible and Culture, is on aging, on our fragility, on our vulnerability, and on who has what kind of who has what kind of stake in what's happening. And I've thought a lot about that. And if you allow me, I would like to read a little poem here.
Please.
That I wrote about. I'll have to bring it up, so it'll take me a second. Hang in there.
That's no problem.
The title of the poem is Plague. Bring out your dead, the old man said, as another soul bit the dust. Even the best and all the rest can be felled, and the old man cussed. Do not go gentle into that dark night, and he spit at the bothersome blight. But the physician said, turn the curse to a cure. Test and make sure for those confined to a sick bed. The doomsday seer, with his gaze so severe, insisted, it's the judgment of Almighty God. But if that is so, why has the blow not struck just the wicked? How odd! The theologian said, somewhere I read that God's not found in the fire, but in the still small voice you can learn his choice and discern the divine desire. Whatever the source, whatever the reason, the time of Lent is the proper season for us all to repent and turn back to the Lord rather than greedily hoard. It's time to be giving so others keep living. This is our call and reward.
What a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, Ben. If people wanted to read more about this, we'll put the link to your Pathos blog to that particular poem there. But if people wanted to get in touch with you or read more about this, where would you point them?
Well, there's several places. The one that keeps coming up is when our daughter passed away due to pulmonary embolism in 2012, I wrote a little book for Christianity Today entitled When a Daughter Dies. And there's a lot of reflection on suffering and sorrow and grieving, mainly about grieving what seems to be an untimely loss or untimely suffering and sorrow. I've had a lot of people ask me about that over the last 8 years and come back to that. In fact, today I put up a podcast that I did with some folks at John Brown University in Arkansas when I was there a month and a half ago about this very subject. And so if they look to my blog today, you will find a link to an oral discussion I had with one of their professors about this. It's something that I've had to reflect a lot on in the last 8 years, because, I mean, grieving for someone who died at 32 is tough, and nobody wants to lose their own children. And so I think I've plumbed the depths of it best I can over the last 8 years.
Well, Ben, thank you for sharing what God has been doing in your life through your scholarship, through your personal issues that you've had and the personal trials that you've faced. And thank you for sharing those with us today.
One more thing, Rob, before we go.
Yeah.
I have a brand new little book out, and I do mean little, like 110 pages, called Who God Is. And the very first chapter, what I'm dealing with in this book is the nouns. God is love, God is light, God is life,
right.
God is spirit, God is one. It seems to me odd that we've spent so much time on the adjectives applied to God in the Bible and not the nouns. That seems a little bizarre. Aren't nouns more important than adjectives? So in the very first chapter, I talk about God is love. And one of the things that comes out of that is an understanding that God is a free agent. He chooses to love us. Yes, it's in accord with his nature, but he still has a choice about it. He even loves us while we are yet sinners, while we are yet his enemies. He chooses to love us, and he gives us the capacity to love him back. Now, it seems to me clear that love cannot be predetermined, it cannot be manipulated, it cannot be coerced. I mean, if you think about when you were courting and dating members of the opposite sex and then eventually got married, there is no way you were going to snooker them into a long-term relationship with you. Love has to be freely given and freely received. If that is the character of God, then we learn a lot of things about freedom, about our response to God, about loving neighbor as self. And we learn that the universe does not work like the professor who said, well, I'm glad that's over with. That was predetermined before the foundation of the universe.
Right. So if you can't say no, then your yes means little or nothing.
And there's no possibility of virtue. There's no possibility of virtue. If you have no other choice, then, in fact, virtue is not possible. Neither is love.
God is love, and aren't we grateful for that? Well, Ben, what a joy to be with you. What a joy to discuss this with you. Thank you so much for taking the time today. We appreciate you.
You're welcome. Good to talk to you. Blessings.
You too. And thanks again to Christ Church Global for sponsoring this episode. Be sure to rate and subscribe. I'm Rob Haynes, and you've been listening to World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast.